Lena was only 17 when she met Eric, a man who seemed to offer an escape from the suffocating monotony of her life. Her small town, with its endless streets of identical houses and the constant whisper of gossip, felt like a prison. Eric, with his smooth words and charming smile, was everything Lena thought she wanted. Someone who could take her away from the dull, predictable life she had always known. He seemed to be everything her teenage heart craved. Exciting, mysterious, and most of all, eager to shower her with attention. He'd whisper sweet promises of adventure, of a future filled with more than she could imagine. At first, everything felt perfect. She was swept up in his love, in his promises of a life beyond the ordinary. But as quickly as the romance began, something darker started to slip through the cracks. At first, it was small things, a lingering touch, an unexpected visit to her workplace, and then the late-night phone calls that became more frequent. It wasn't the love Lena had expected. Eric began to show a side of himself that unsettled her, one that demanded control over every part of her life. He insisted she cut ties with friends, stopped seeing her family, and questioned every decision she made. She told herself it was just his way of showing care, but deep down, a creeping feeling of dread began to grow. Lena was trapped in a relationship where her every move was monitored, where her personal space was violated, and where her independence slowly slipped away. When Eric suggested they move in together, Lena felt a mixture of excitement and fear. The promise of starting a new life felt too alluring to resist, despite the nagging unease in her stomach. They moved into a house on the edge of town, isolated from everything she had ever known, and that was when the true horror began to surface. The house, with its dark corners and heavy silence, felt alive in a way that made Lena's skin crawl. The air seemed thick, as though it were pressing down on her, suffocating her with every breath. There were no sounds of life outside, only the unsettling hum of silence. Eric, once the charming man who had promised her the world, became a shadow that loomed over every inch of her existence. He would show up uninvited, and his gaze, once filled with affection, now carried an unsettling weight of control. The once comforting sound of his voice now echoed in her mind as a constant reminder that she was no longer free. The house became a prison, and Lena, despite every instinct screaming for escape, began to realize the horrible truth. There was no way out. She had willingly stepped into a nightmare, and now it was far too late to wake up. Every day, she felt herself slipping further, the walls closing in, her fear growing, until she was sure she'd disappear into the house's suffocating embrace. The man who once seemed like a dream was now the nightmare from which there was no escape. The dread grew slowly at first, creeping under the door like a fog that never lifted. Eric's behavior started to shift in ways Lena couldn't explain. At first, it was the mood swings, a sudden coldness in his eyes when he looked at her, a silence that stretched on too long. But it wasn't just his behavior that unnerved her. It was the way the house itself began to change. The walls, once just walls, seemed to close in around her, as if they were watching, waiting. She'd hear strange noises at night. Footsteps echoing in the hall when no one was there, doors creaking open by themselves, faint whispers that would freeze her in place. Every sound in the house made her skin crawl. At first, she dismissed it as her imagination, but the longer she stayed, the harder it was to ignore. Eric's watchful eyes were always on her, even when he wasn't near. The phone calls became more frequent, more urgent, as if every minute she wasn't by his side was a betrayal. He would show up unannounced, peering through the windows, watching her from the shadows. The boundaries of what she could and couldn't do began to dissolve. He insisted on driving her everywhere, controlling every part of her life. But it wasn't just the control that scared her. It was the way he manipulated her. He'd speak to her in soft tones, telling her how much he loved her, how she needed him, that no one else could understand her like he did. But the words didn't match the chill that crept into his gaze. She noticed the way he started isolating her from everything, her friends, her family, until the only person she had left was him. The walls of the house felt alive, trapping her, and Lena began to lose sense of time. Days felt like weeks, weeks like months. Her once vibrant world was reduced to this suffocating dark place where fear was the only constant. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, even when she thought she was alone. Every movement was calculated, every decision weighed against the unspoken consequences of angering him. She could feel her sanity slipping away as she tried to stay calm, tried to hold on to who she was, but the more she fought against it, the deeper she fell into the nightmare. The house was no longer just a home, it was a tomb, and she was its unwilling prisoner. The feeling of suffocation intensified with each passing day, and Lena's world seemed to twist further into darkness. The house, once a refuge, had become something far worse, a place of lurking terror. It wasn't just the isolation that was starting to eat away at her, but the disturbing sense that the house itself was alive, watching her every move. Every room felt colder than it should be, the air thicker, as if the walls were closing in even tighter. At night, the darkness felt oppressive, swallowing every sound, leaving her with nothing but the unsettling quiet that made her skin prickle. The floorboards groaned under the weight of unseen footsteps, and the mirrors, once a simple reflection, now seemed to distort her image, twisting her face into something unrecognizable, as if even her own reflection was mocking her. Lena could never quite shake the feeling that someone, or something, was always just behind her. Eric's presence loomed over her like a shadow, silent but suffocating. He would disappear for hours at a time, leaving her alone in the eerie silence of the house. But the moment he returned, it was as if his mere presence sucked the life from her. His mood swings became more erratic, his eyes colder, more distant, and when he spoke to her, his words dripped with something darker than before, a quiet venom disguised as concern. He would ask her if she was okay, but there was no care in his voice, only a twisted satisfaction in watching her unravel. Lena tried to find small escapes, moments when she could breathe, but each attempt was thwarted. If she went outside, he'd follow, watching from the windows like a silent predator. If she tried to speak to anyone, she'd find herself cut off by a sudden, harsh text or an unexpected visit. And then there were the nights. The nights were the worst. The house seemed to come alive with a malevolent energy that gripped her throat and wouldn't let go. The noises grew louder, scratching at the walls, faint whispers just out of reach of her understanding. Sometimes she would wake in the middle of the night to find Eric staring at her, his eyes wide and unblinking, as if he were waiting for something. When she asked him what was wrong, he would smile, too wide, too cold, and tell her nothing, that it was just a bad dream. But Lena knew better. She knew there was something inside that house, something that wasn't Eric, something that was feeding off her fear. She could feel it growing stronger with each passing night, pressing in on her, until she could no longer tell where Eric's cruelty ended and the house's horror began. She was trapped, and the walls were closing in. Lena's reality had begun to warp, the line between the house's terror and Eric's cruelty blurring until she couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. Each day felt like a countdown to something she couldn't see, but could feel creeping closer. The house was no longer just a prison. It was a living, breathing nightmare. The air grew colder with each passing night, thick with the sensation of something lurking just beyond her vision. Something she could never fully understand, but always felt watching her. The mirrors, once ordinary, now seemed to twist her reflection into something sinister. Her eyes, once vibrant, were now shadowed and hollow, and she could barely recognize the girl in the glass. It was as if the house was draining her, pulling her life away with every glance. But Eric's presence was even worse. His eyes, once full of affection, now held an emptiness that sent a chill straight through her. When he touched her, his skin felt cold, unnatural, as though there was something else inside him, something not human. His smiles were colder now, his words sharper, cutting deeper. He would whisper things to her at night, low, guttural murmurs that made her blood run cold. "You're mine," he'd say, his voice like gravel, his breath foul against her skin. "You'll never escape me." Every night, she could hear him moving through the house, whispering in the dark. There were no longer any comforting moments, no laughter, no warmth. Every inch of the house felt hostile, every door a reminder of her imprisonment. The worst came when she realized she was no longer alone in the house, even when Eric wasn't there. Strange noises echoed through the halls at night, things that didn't make sense, footsteps that were too heavy, voices too low, the sound of something dragging across the floor. She would wake up to find things moved in the house, furniture out of place, objects she never remembered touching now scattered across the floor. But when she asked Eric about it, he would act as if nothing had happened, brushing it off with that same chilling smile. One night, she woke to find Eric standing at the foot of her bed, staring down at her, his eyes wide, unblinking, too still. His expression was twisted, not the loving gaze she had once known, but something darker, more predatory. "It's almost time," he whispered, as if the words were meant for something beyond her. In that moment, Lena realized something that sent a wave of terror crashing over her. This wasn't just a man, and this wasn't just a house. This was something far worse, something ancient, something hungry, and it was closing in on her, piece by piece, until there would be nothing left. Lena had stopped sleeping. There was no rest in the house anymore, no peace to be found in the shadows of night. It had become a place of unrelenting dread, every creak of the floorboards, every faint whisper in the walls, a reminder that escape was impossible. The house had grown colder, the air thick with something foul, suffocating, as if it too was waiting for something. Eric had become more erratic, his presence like a storm waiting to break. His words twisted in the air, each one feeling like a nail driven into her chest. "You'll never leave," he would say, his voice calm, almost affectionate, but the deadness in his eyes told a different story. The man she had once trusted, the man who had promised her a life beyond this hell, was no longer human. He had become a vessel for something darker, something that had seeped into the very bones of the house, something that fed off her fear. It was then, in the deepest, darkest corner of the night, that Lena felt it. The final shift. The house no longer felt like a home, but like a tomb, suffocating her with its twisted grip. There was no way out, no way to escape the nightmare that had taken root in her life. And then it happened. The walls seemed to close in, the house groaning under some invisible weight. Lena heard a sound, a low, guttural growl that didn't come from Eric. She turned to look at him, but his eyes were wide, unblinking, locked on something in the corner of the room. It was then that she saw it, a dark shape, its eyes glowing, watching her with an intense hunger. The room seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, as if the very house was alive and feeding off her terror. Eric was no longer himself. He stood, frozen, as the shape in the corner seemed to move, its dark presence growing stronger. Lena tried to scream, to run, but her body refused to obey, as if the house had taken control of her every move. The walls closed in, and for the first time, she realized with terrifying clarity that she had never been alone. The house wasn't just a prison, it was the living manifestation of something ancient, something that had claimed her, claimed Eric, and would now claim them both. With one final scream, Lena felt herself pulled into the darkness, the house swallowing her whole. No one would ever find her. No one would ever escape. The nightmare would continue, forever,